Across the Galactic Federation, one rule stands absolute: humans are forbidden from participating in any military conflict. Not because they're weak, but because when they finally joined the galactic community, they brought with them records of something so terrifying that even the most warlike alien species unanimously agreed to keep them out of all warfare. Now, as the Federation faces its darkest hour against an unstoppable enemy, a group of elite alien recruits is about to discover why their instructors' faces turn pale when they mention the human military archives. They're about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't the one that destroys your enemy, it's the one that turns your enemy into your weapon. What could possibly be so horrifying about human warfare that an entire galaxy of warrior races would rather face extinction than unleash it again? The answer lies buried in classified files marked with a single, chilling designation: species-level psychological warfare, permanently restricted. But desperate times call for desperate measures, and some secrets are too dangerous to stay buried forever. The crimson glow of Kepler Station's emergency lighting cast long shadows across the tactical briefing room as Commander Vexai studied the faces of the 12 beings seated before him. Each recruit represented the finest warrior tradition of their respective species, hand-picked from across the galaxy for this final, desperate mission. The Zephyrian war machine had consumed 17 sectors in as many cycles, and conventional warfare had proven utterly useless against their adaptive technology. Zarathak, the towering Krillian with chitinous armor plates that caught the red light like polished obsidian, shifted restlessly in her reinforced chair. Her forearms remained perfectly still, but her compound eyes betrayed the predator's instinct that had made her species the most feared shock troops in 3 spiral arms. Beside her, Theron's crystalline form refracted the emergency lighting into rainbow patterns across the metal walls. The resonance mineral-based physiology allowed him to literally sing enemy fortifications apart, and his harmonic warfare techniques had turned the tide in dozens of battles. The rest of the squad represented an equally impressive collection of galactic military might. There was Corbin, whose cybernetic enhancements had replaced most of his original Nexari biology with weapons systems. His people had turned themselves into living war machines, sacrificing emotion and comfort for pure combat efficiency. Alongside him sat Veranoon, a phantom whose natural phase-shifting abilities made her the perfect infiltrator and assassin. Commander Vexai himself belonged to the hegemonic collective, a species that had conquered their home galaxy through superior tactical thinking and absolute logical warfare. His gray skin bore the ritual scars of 1,000 tactical victories, and his large black eyes held the cold calculation that had made his people natural strategists. Yet even he found himself struggling with the briefing materials that lay before him on the holographic display. "Recruits," Vexai began, his voice carrying the authority of one who had commanded fleets across star systems, "you have been selected not just for your individual combat prowess, but for your ability to adapt to new forms of warfare. The Zephyrian threat has forced us to consider options that the Galactic Federation has kept sealed for over 2 centuries. The holographic display flickered to life, showing the devastating spread of Zephyrian conquest. Entire star systems appeared as dead zones, marked in the pulsing black that indicated complete communication loss. The geometric patterns of their expansion showed a terrifying efficiency that had military analysts across the galaxy baffled. Theron's crystalline body resonated with a low, questioning tone that served as his species' equivalent of raised eyebrows. "Commander, our intelligence suggests the Zephyrians possess adaptive technology that counters any weapon system after initial exposure. How do we combat an enemy that learns from every attack?" "That," Vexai replied, his fingers dancing across the control surface, "is precisely why you are here. There exists a form of warfare so effective, so psychologically devastating, that it was banned from galactic use by unanimous vote of all member species. A type of combat developed by a species that was specifically prohibited from participating in any military conflict following their admission to the Federation." Corbin's mechanical augmentations whirred softly as he processed this information. Which species achieved something that made the entire galaxy agree to restrict them? The display shifted, and, for the first time since entering the briefing room, Commander Vexai's composed demeanor cracked slightly. A new holographic image appeared, showing a blue and green world orbiting a single yellow star. The planet looked remarkably peaceful, with swirling white clouds and vast green continents that suggested abundant life. "Earth," Vexai said quietly. "Home to a species called humans." Murmurs rippled through the assembled recruits. Most had heard of humans in passing, as they were one of the newer members of the Galactic Federation. They were known primarily for their diplomatic corps and their surprisingly advanced scientific research, despite their relatively recent achievement of faster-than-light travel. They held no significant military positions and seemed content to contribute to galactic society through peaceful means. Zarathek's mandibles clicked together in the Krillian equivalent of laughter. Humans? Commander, I have met several human diplomats. They are small, soft creatures with no natural weapons, no armor plating, and reaction times that barely qualify them as sentient by most military standards. Their homeworld has never even experienced a proper interstellar war. You are correct about their physical limitations, Vexhai acknowledged. Humans are indeed smaller and less physically capable than most galactic species. They have no natural armor, no poison, no ability to phase through matter or sing matter apart or interface directly with technology. But you are wrong about their experience with war. The display changed again, and this time the image that appeared made several recruits instinctively reach for weapons that weren't there. It was a tactical readout showing casualty figures that seemed impossible. Numbers in the hundreds of millions, spread across multiple conflicts on a single planet, often occurring simultaneously. Before achieving spaceflight, Vexhai continued, his voice taking on a tone that suggested he was reading from classified documents for the first time himself. Humanity spent approximately 6,000 years in constant warfare against itself. Not occasional territorial disputes or resource conflicts, but continuous, total warfare involving progressively more devastating weapons and tactics. Veranun materialized more solidly in her chair, abandoning the partial phase state she normally maintained. That's impossible. No species can sustain that level of conflict without destroying itself. And, yet, Vexhai replied, pulling up another display, they not only survived but developed what our xenopsychologists have termed adaptive conflict resolution to a degree that makes Zephyrian technology look primitive. They didn't just learn to fight effectively, they learned to fight in ways that turned their enemies' strengths against them. Theron's crystalline form pulsed with confused harmonics. Commander, I fail to understand how a species with such a violent history was admitted to the Federation. Surely their aggressive nature would be considered a threat. Because, Vexhai said, pausing to check his security clearance one more time before continuing, when humanity finally achieved interstellar travel and encountered the galactic community, they had already solved their internal conflict problem. They applied the same terrifying creativity they had developed for warfare toward ending warfare itself. They became masters of psychological conflict resolution. The briefing room fell silent except for the hum of life support systems and the distant vibration of the station's engines. Each recruit was processing this information through the lens of their own species' military doctrine, and none of it made sense within their understanding of warfare. Corvin's mechanical voice cut through the silence. What type of warfare could be so effective that the entire galaxy would agree to ban it? Vexhai's fingers hesitated over the controls. Before I show you the classified materials from the human military archives, I need to remind you that this briefing is classified at the highest level. The techniques you are about to learn have been sealed away because they were deemed too dangerous for general galactic use. The only reason we are accessing them now is because the Zephyrian threat represents an extinction-level event for our civilization. He entered a complex authorization code, and the display shifted to show a simple text header: Human Military Doctrine, Psychological Operations and Adaptive Warfare Principles. Humans, Vexhai continued, do not fight to destroy their enemies. They fight to make their enemies destroy themselves. The first document that appeared on the display was a historical analysis of something called World War II from human history. The casualty figures were staggering, but what caught the attention of the military minds in the room were the tactical approaches described in the archived materials. Zarathek's compound eyes focused intently on the display. These tactical descriptions suggest they convinced enemy forces to attack their own allies. How is such a thing possible? Psychological warfare, Vexhai replied. Humans developed the ability to understand not just their enemies' capabilities, but their deepest fears, their cultural weaknesses, their social pressure points. They could analyze an enemy force and design attacks that would cause psychological rather than physical damage. The display showed a tactical diagram of something called Operation Mincemeat, where humans had convinced an enemy army to deploy their forces in the wrong location entirely by creating false intelligence so believable that the enemy trusted it over their own reconnaissance. Theron resonated with disbelief. They convinced their enemies to make tactical errors voluntarily? More than that, Vexhai said, pulling up additional files. They developed techniques for making enemies want to make tactical errors. They could manipulate enemy decision-making processes so completely that their opponents would choose to do exactly what would lead to their own defeat, and believe it was their own idea. The briefing materials revealed layer after layer of human military innovation that had nothing to do with superior weapons or armor. There were techniques for spreading doubt among enemy leadership, methods for turning enemy propaganda against itself, and psychological operations that could cause entire military formations to surrender without a single shot being fired. Vera Noon shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Commander, these techniques suggest a level of psychological manipulation that borders on mental warfare. No wonder the galaxy chose to restrict such methods. The restriction, Vexhai explained, was not implemented because these techniques were considered unethical, though many species did raise such concerns. The restriction was implemented because every species that studied human military doctrine began experiencing internal conflicts within their own military structures. Simply learning about psychological warfare made military leaders paranoid about their own allies using such techniques against them. Corvin's augmentations processed this information with mechanical efficiency. A form of warfare that is dangerous simply to know about? Precisely. Human military doctrine was so psychologically sophisticated that it could not be contained within traditional military structures. Once military leaders understood that such techniques existed, they began seeing psychological attacks everywhere, even from their own allies. Several species experienced complete military reorganizations after their leadership became convinced that their own officers were employing human techniques against them. The irony was not lost on any of the recruits. Humanity's most effective weapon was its ability to make enemies paranoid about their own allies, and that weapon had proven so effective that even studying it caused the same paranoia among those who learned about it. Zarathek's mandibles clicked thoughtfully. And now we are being asked to learn these same techniques? You are being asked to do more than learn them, Vexhai replied grimly. You are being asked to employ them against the Zephyrians. Our conventional forces have failed against their adaptive technology because we have been fighting the kind of war they expected. Human doctrine suggests that the solution is not to fight better, but to fight in ways that make the enemy's strengths irrelevant. The display showed the current tactical situation against the Zephyrian forces. Their adaptive technology had countered kinetic weapons, energy weapons, chemical warfare, biological attacks, and even temporal manipulation devices. Each weapon system worked exactly once before the Zephyrians developed countermeasures that made subsequent attacks useless. However, Vexhai continued, there is no evidence that Zephyrian technology can adapt to psychological warfare because psychological warfare does not attack technology or even physical systems. It attacks decision-making processes. It makes enemies choose to defeat themselves. Theron's harmonics shifted to a pattern that indicated deep thought. Are you suggesting that we can defeat Zephyrian adaptive technology by convincing the Zephyrians not to use it effectively? I am suggesting, Vexhai replied, that human military doctrine offers approaches that the Zephyrians cannot have prepared for, because no galactic species has employed such techniques for over 2 centuries. We can attack them in ways they do not expect, using weapons they cannot detect, causing damage they cannot measure or counter. The briefing room hummed with tension as each recruit contemplated the implications. They were being asked to learn techniques so psychologically sophisticated that they had been banned by galactic consensus, and to use those techniques against an enemy that had proven unstoppable through conventional warfare. Corvin's mechanical voice carried a note of uncertainty that was unusual for his species. What guarantee do we have that learning such techniques will not compromise our own military effectiveness? None, Vexhai replied honestly. The same psychological principles that make these techniques effective against enemies can potentially be turned against allies. However, the alternative is the extinction of our civilization. The Zephyrian advance has not slowed in any sector, and our defensive capabilities are being overwhelmed. The weight of their situation settled over the recruits like a heavy blanket. They were being asked to open a box that had been sealed for good reason, to wield weapons that were as dangerous to the wielder as to the target. Vera Noon's form solidified completely as she leaned forward. Commander, how do we learn to fight like humans without becoming like humans? For the first time during the briefing, Vexhai smiled, though it was not an expression that suggested confidence. According to the files, we don't. The human military doctrine cannot be learned without changing how you think about warfare, about allies, about enemies, and about yourself. Once you understand how psychological warfare operates, you cannot return to seeing conflict in simple terms. The display shifted one final time, showing a simple text message that had been attached to the human military archives when they were sealed. These techniques are effective because they reveal truths about warfare that most species prefer not to acknowledge. Use with extreme caution. The most dangerous enemy you will face is the doubt these methods create about your own allies. The briefing room fell silent again, this time with a different quality of silence. Each recruit was beginning to understand that they were not just being asked to learn new weapons or tactics. They were being asked to think about warfare in ways that would fundamentally change how they saw every future conflict. Your training, HFY announced, begins tomorrow. You will learn to see warfare through human eyes, to understand how psychological attacks operate, and to employ techniques that have been classified as too dangerous for galactic use. By the time your training is complete, you will be capable of defeating enemies without them realizing they are under attack. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. But, remember this warning from the human archives: the greatest victims of psychological warfare are often those who employ it. You will be fighting not just to save the galaxy, but to save yourselves from becoming the kind of warriors that the galaxy fears most. As the recruits filed out of the briefing room, each lost in their own thoughts about what they had just committed to learning, none of them noticed that Commander HFY remained behind, staring at a section of the human archives that he had not shared with them. A section marked with a warning that made his hands shake as he read it: psychological warfare techniques contained herein have a 73% probability of causing permanent personality changes in non-human users. Recommend maximum exposure time of 30 standard days before psychological evaluation required. The training was scheduled to last 60 days. The training complex on Kepler Station had been hastily modified to accommodate the classified nature of their education. Soundproof chambers lined with psionic dampeners ensured that no fragment of human military doctrine could leak beyond the designated learning areas. Dr. Elena Vasquez, one of only 3 humans cleared to teach these restricted techniques, stood before the 12 assembled recruits with an expression that mixed professional competence with barely concealed concern. Unlike the imposing military presence of Commander HFY, Dr. Vasquez appeared almost fragile by galactic standards. Her brown hair was streaked with premature gray, and her dark eyes held a weariness that seemed to age her beyond her apparent years. She wore simple civilian clothing rather than military uniform, and her only visible equipment was a standard Federation datapad and a small case containing what appeared to be historical artifacts from Earth. Before we begin, Dr. Vasquez said, her voice carrying an accent that several of the recruits had learned was characteristic of Earth's North American regions, I need you to understand something that was not included in your briefing materials. Everything you are about to learn comes with a cost. Not a financial cost or a time cost, but a psychological cost that will permanently change how you see other beings. Zarathek's mandibles clicked with impatience. Doctor, we are trained warriors. We have all witnessed the psychological trauma of combat. We understand the costs of war. No, Dr. Vasquez replied quietly, you understand the costs of physical war. Psychological warfare is different because it requires you to see your enemies not as opponents to be defeated, but as thinking, feeling beings whose thoughts and emotions can be manipulated. To use these techniques effectively, you must first learn to understand your enemies better than they understand themselves. She activated her datapad, and the room's holographic displays came to life with what appeared to be a simple historical document. It was a letter written by a human soldier to his family during something called the Vietnam conflict, describing his fears, his hopes, and his love for his children. Theron's crystalline form resonated with confusion. Doctor, why are we reading personal correspondence from ancient human conflicts? Because, Dr. Vasquez replied, the first principle of human psychological warfare is empathy. You cannot manipulate someone's psychology without first understanding it completely. This letter represents the mindset of a young human facing uncertainty and danger. Now, if you were fighting against this soldier, how would you use this information? The recruits exchanged glances, unsure of the purpose behind the exercise. Corvin's mechanical augmentations whirred as he processed the question with typical Nexary logic. The letter reveals emotional attachments that could be exploited. Threaten his family to compromise his combat effectiveness. That, Dr. Vasquez said with a slight shake of her head, is conventional psychological intimidation. It might work once, but it creates enemies who fight with desperation rather than confusion. Human doctrine approaches the problem differently. The display changed, showing a series of propaganda leaflets that had been dropped over enemy positions during Earth's various conflicts. Rather than threatening messages or demands for surrender, the leaflets contained poetry, photographs of families, and reminders of peaceful times at home. Veranoon studied the materials intently. These messages seemed designed to increase enemy morale rather than decrease it. Precisely, Dr. Vasquez confirmed. Human psychological warfare recognizes that a homesick enemy is more dangerous than a hopeless enemy, but a homesick enemy is also more likely to make mistakes based on emotional rather than tactical considerations. These leaflets were not designed to make enemy soldiers surrender. They were designed to make enemy soldiers think about home at tactically inappropriate moments. The concept was so foreign to traditional military thinking that several recruits struggled to process it. Warfare, as understood by every galactic species, involved defeating enemy morale, destroying their will to fight, or eliminating their capacity for resistance. The idea of deliberately encouraging certain types of enemy morale while discouraging others seemed counterintuitive. Dr. Vasquez moved to the next phase of the lesson, displaying tactical reports from human military engagements that demonstrated the effectiveness of such approaches. Enemy units that had been exposed to homesickness propaganda showed statistically significant increases in tactical errors, communication mistakes, and failure to follow orders precisely. The goal, she explained, was never to make enemies stop fighting. The goal was to make enemies fight badly. Corvin's augmentations clicked audibly as he processed this distinction. Doctor, this approach seems to require extensive knowledge of enemy psychology and culture. How did human military forces acquire such detailed understanding of their opponents? The question prompted Dr. Vasquez to pause, and, for the first time since beginning the lesson, she appeared genuinely uncomfortable. That brings us to the second principle of human psychological warfare, research methodology. The display shifted to show what appeared to be academic research documents, but, as the recruits studied the materials more closely, they realized they were looking at military intelligence reports disguised as anthropological studies. Human military forces had systematically studied every aspect of their enemy's cultural psychology, not through interrogation or espionage, but through careful observation and analysis of enemy behavior patterns. Human military doctrine, Dr. Vasquez continued, treats every enemy as a puzzle to be solved rather than an obstacle to be overcome. Before engaging any opponent, human forces would spend enormous resources learning how that enemy thought, what they valued, what they feared, and, most importantly, what they believed about themselves. Zarathek's compound eyes focused on a particular document that outlined the psychological profile of an enemy general, including details about his childhood fears and his relationship with his parents. Doctor, this level of personal information seems to require intelligence capabilities that border on invasion of privacy. It does, Dr. Vasquez admitted. Human psychological warfare assumes that privacy is a luxury that cannot be afforded during wartime. Everything about an enemy becomes relevant tactical information. The ethical implications hung heavy in the training chamber as each recruit contemplated what they were being asked to learn. Traditional galactic warfare maintained certain boundaries even during the most intense conflicts. Soldiers fought soldiers, military installations were legitimate targets, and civilian populations were generally protected by various interstellar treaties. Human doctrine appeared to erase such boundaries by treating enemy psychology as a battlefield that encompassed everything from childhood memories to personal relationships. Theron's harmonic pattern shifted to indicate deep discomfort. Doctor, these techniques seem to require treating enemy beings as objects to be manipulated rather than as opponents worthy of respect. Yes, Dr. Vasquez replied simply. That is exactly what they require. Human psychological warfare is effective because it abandons the concept of honorable combat in favor of total psychological domination. She moved to the next section of training materials, which demonstrated practical applications of psychological profiling in combat situations. The examples showed human military units using enemy generals' known personality traits against them, manipulating their decision-making processes by presenting tactical situations that would appeal to their personal biases rather than their military training. One particularly detailed case study showed how human forces had defeated a superior enemy army by convincing the enemy commander that attacking would bring him the personal glory he craved, when in fact attacking would lead him directly into a carefully prepared trap. The enemy commander had made the decision to attack enthusiastically, believing it was his own tactical insight rather than manipulation. Veranoon materialized more solidly as she leaned forward to study the case study. The enemy commander never realized he was being manipulated? That's the key, Dr. Vasquez explained. Effective psychological warfare feels like inspiration rather than manipulation to the target. The enemy commander believed he was making a brilliant tactical decision based on his superior understanding of the battlefield. The implications were staggering. Traditional warfare involved defeating enemy forces through superior strategy, better weapons, or more effective tactics. Human doctrine suggested that the most effective approach was to make enemies defeat themselves while believing they were winning. Corbin's mechanical voice carried a note of what might have been admiration in an organic being. Doctor, this approach would make conventional military intelligence completely unreliable. If enemy actions cannot be trusted to represent enemy intentions, how does one plan defensive strategies? You don't, Dr. Vasquez replied. Human psychological warfare operates on the assumption that defensive strategies are ultimately inferior to offensive strategies that manipulate enemy thinking. Rather than trying to predict what enemies will do, you manipulate them into doing what you want them to do. The training chamber's environmental systems hummed quietly as the recruits processed this fundamental shift in military philosophy. Every species in the galaxy had developed sophisticated defensive strategies based on predicting and countering enemy actions. Human doctrine suggested abandoning such approaches entirely in favor of controlling enemy actions directly. Dr. Vasquez opened her small case of historical artifacts, revealing what appeared to be simple objects: a compass, a map, a photograph, and a piece of fabric. These items were recovered from a human military operation that successfully convinced an entire enemy division to march directly into a mountain pass where they would be trapped by winter weather. She held up the compass first. This compass was deliberately damaged and left where enemy scouts would find it. The damage was carefully calculated to introduce a specific directional error that would seem like normal wear rather than sabotage. Next came the map. This map contained subtle inaccuracies that made the mountain pass appear more accessible than it actually was. The inaccuracies were based on psychological studies of how the enemy culture interpreted geographic information. The photograph showed a group of smiling soldiers in winter gear. This photograph was planted along with the map and compass to suggest that human forces had successfully crossed the mountain pass recently, making it appear safe and navigable. Finally, she held up the piece of fabric. This fabric was chemically treated to carry the scent of specific foods that psychological profiles had identified as comfort foods for the enemy culture. The scent would create subconscious positive associations with the mountain pass route. Zarathek's mandibles clicked rapidly as she processed the complexity of the operation. Doctor, this single tactical deception required detailed knowledge of enemy psychology, enemy culture, enemy navigation methods, and even enemy dietary preferences. Correct, Dr. Vasquez confirmed. And it required months of preparation to create artifacts that would seem naturally occurring rather than planted. Human psychological warfare assumes that the most effective deceptions are those that targets participate in creating. Theron resonated with a harmonic pattern that indicated he was struggling to understand something fundamental. Doctor, how did the enemy division participate in creating their own deception? Because, Dr. Vasquez explained, once they found these items, they had to make sense of them. Human doctrine recognizes that intelligent beings will automatically create explanations for unexpected information, and those explanations become more believable to the person creating them than to anyone else. The enemy commander didn't just find evidence that the mountain pass was safe, he convinced himself that it was safe based on evidence he had discovered personally. The psychological sophistication required for such operations was unlike anything in galactic military doctrine. Most species approached warfare through technological superiority, numerical advantage, or tactical innovation. Human doctrine required understanding enemy psychology so completely that enemy decision-making processes could be predicted and manipulated with mathematical precision. Dr. Vasquez moved to the final section of the day's training materials, which contained what appeared to be simple communication transcripts. These are records of radio communications between human psychological warfare specialists and enemy forces during active operations. The transcripts revealed conversations that seemed like routine military communications, but careful analysis revealed that every exchange was designed to plant specific ideas in enemy thinking without the enemy realizing they were being influenced. One transcript showed a human operator posing as a neutral communications relay, passing messages between enemy units while subtly altering the content to increase confusion and mistrust between different enemy commanders. The alterations were so subtle that they appeared to be normal communication errors, but they systematically undermined enemy coordination. Veranoon studied the transcripts with growing alarm. Doctor, these communication alterations would be nearly impossible to detect during active operations. That's correct, Dr. Vasquez confirmed. Human psychological warfare assumes that enemy forces will be too busy fighting to carefully analyze every communication for potential manipulation. The technique exploits the fact that military communications must be trusted to function, and that trust can be weaponized. Corbin's augmentations processed the implications with mechanical efficiency. Doctor, these techniques would make any form of military communication potentially unreliable. How do human forces avoid being victims of their own methods? The question prompted Dr. Vasquez to pause again, and this time her discomfort was clearly visible. That, she said quietly, is one of the reasons why human psychological warfare doctrine was classified at the highest levels. The techniques are so effective that they can be turned against their users. She pulled up a classified addendum to the training materials that none of the recruits had seen before. It contains psychological evaluation reports from human military personnel who had employed psychological warfare techniques extensively. The reports made for disturbing reading. Human soldiers who had become experts in psychological manipulation had begun experiencing paranoia about their own military communications, suspicion of their own commanders, and difficulty trusting any information they had not personally verified. The very skills that made them effective at psychological warfare made them ineffective at normal military cooperation. The human military, Dr. Vasquez continued, eventually developed specialized psychological warfare units that operated separately from regular forces specifically to prevent these contamination effects. But, the separation was not always successful. Theron's harmonic patterns shifted to indicate growing concern. Doctor, are you suggesting that learning these techniques will make us paranoid about our own allies? I'm suggesting, Dr. Vasquez replied, that once you truly understand how psychological manipulation operates, you will begin to see potential psychological attacks everywhere, including from sources that are not actually engaging in psychological warfare. The human archives contain warnings that extensive training in psychological warfare techniques can create permanent changes in threat assessment patterns. The training chamber fell silent as each recruit contemplated the implications. They were being asked to learn techniques so psychologically sophisticated that they could potentially undermine their ability to function within normal military structures. Zarathek's voice carried an unusual note of uncertainty. Doctor, given these risks, how do we maintain operational effectiveness while learning human psychological warfare doctrine? Dr. Vasquez closed her case of historical artifacts and looked directly at each recruit in turn. According to the human archives, she said quietly, you don't. These techniques cannot be learned without accepting that they will change how you think about warfare, about allies, about enemies, and about yourself. The question is whether the galactic situation is desperate enough to justify those changes. The weight of their decision hung heavy in the training chamber as the recruits contemplated what they had committed to learning. Tomorrow, they would begin practical exercises in psychological manipulation, and there would be no going back to the certainties of conventional warfare. Dr. Vasquez gathered her materials and prepared to leave, but paused at the chamber door. One final warning from the human archives, she said without turning around. The most dangerous enemy you will face is not the Zephyrians. It will be the doubt these methods create about everyone around you, including each other. As she left the chamber, the 12 recruits sat in silence, each beginning to wonder if their fellow trainees were already practicing psychological warfare techniques on them. Week 3 of training began with an exercise that Dr. Vasquez announced would test their understanding of human psychological warfare principles in practical application. The 12 recruits found themselves divided into 2 groups of 6, each assigned to opposite ends of Kepler Station's modified training complex. Between them lay a series of tactical scenarios that would require coordination, trust, and traditional military cooperation to solve successfully. Your objective, Dr. Vasquez explained through the station's communication system, is simple. Both teams must successfully navigate their respective tactical challenges and meet in the center chamber within 4 hours. However, you will be required to coordinate your efforts without direct communication, using only the information systems that have been provided. The information systems, as it turned out, were sophisticated enough to allow detailed tactical planning and resource sharing between the teams. Messages could be sent, tactical maps could be shared, and even real-time video communication was possible. Everything needed for successful military coordination was available. What Dr. Vasquez did not tell them was that she would be monitoring all communications and occasionally implementing subtle alterations based on human psychological warfare techniques they had been studying. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, just minor adjustments that would test whether the recruits could maintain operational trust while knowing that psychological manipulation was possible. Team Alpha, consisting of Zarathek, Theron, Corbin, Veranun, and 2 other specialists, found themselves facing a tactical puzzle that required precise timing and coordination with Team Beta. Their chamber contained a series of energy barriers that could only be deactivated by synchronized actions performed simultaneously in both chambers. Team Beta, led by Commander Vexhai himself along with 5 other experienced military personnel, faced a mirror version of the same challenge. The barriers in their chamber were connected to the barriers in Alpha's chamber, creating a situation where neither team could succeed without trusting the other completely. The first hour proceeded smoothly. Both teams analyzed their tactical situations, shared information freely, and developed a coordination plan that should have allowed them to complete the exercise easily. The communication between teams was professional, clear, and efficient. Then, Dr. Vasquez began implementing minor alterations to their communications. The changes were subtle at first. A message from Team Beta indicating they were ready to proceed was altered to ready to proceed when circumstances permit, introducing a note of uncertainty that had not been in the original communication. A tactical update from Team Alpha describing their optimal approach was changed to potentially optimal approach, suggesting doubt that had not existed in the original message. Corvin was the first to notice something was wrong. His mechanical augmentations were designed to detect inconsistencies in communication patterns, and, after studying human psychological warfare techniques for 3 weeks, he had become hypersensitive to potential manipulation indicators. Team Alpha, he announced over their internal communications, I am detecting minor inconsistencies in the messages we are receiving from Team Beta. The language patterns suggest possible psychological manipulation. Zarathek's compound eyes focused intently on her tactical display. Specify the nature of these inconsistencies. The messages contain subtle expressions of uncertainty that do not match the confident tactical assessments we have received from Team Beta in previous exercises, Corvin replied. Either Team Beta has become uncertain about their capabilities, or our communications are being altered. The possibility that their communications were being manipulated introduced exactly the kind of doubt that Dr. Vasquez had warned them about. Theron's crystalline form began resonating with harmonic patterns that indicated stress. If our communications are being altered, how can we coordinate effectively with Team Beta? More importantly, Veranun added while maintaining a partial phase state that indicated combat readiness, if our communications are being altered, how do we know that Team Beta is receiving our actual messages rather than manipulated versions? The tactical situation became exponentially more complex as Team Alpha found themselves trying to solve not just the puzzle of the energy barriers, but the meta-puzzle of determining whether they could trust their own communication systems. Every message from Team Beta was now subject to analysis for potential signs of manipulation, and every message they sent to Team Beta might be arriving in altered form. Meanwhile, Team Beta was experiencing similar concerns. Commander Vexhai had noticed that Team Alpha's messages seemed to contain subtle questions about Team Beta's commitment to the exercise, phrases like assuming your team maintains readiness and if your tactical situation remains stable. These suggestions of doubt were completely inconsistent with Team Alpha's previous communication patterns. Team Beta, Commander Vexhai announced, we may be dealing with a psychological warfare exercise rather than a simple tactical coordination exercise. Our communications with Team Alpha appear to be experiencing subtle alterations designed to create distrust. The observation was accurate, but it created a new problem. If both teams knew that their communications might be altered, how could they coordinate the precise timing required to deactivate the energy barriers simultaneously? Team Alpha spent the second hour developing increasingly complex communication protocols designed to detect and counter potential psychological manipulation. They implemented verification codes, redundant messaging systems, and cross-reference checks that would theoretically allow them to identify altered communications. Team Beta took a different approach, deciding to ignore the potential for manipulation entirely and proceed with the exercise as if their communications were trustworthy. Commander Vexhai's logic was that allowing paranoia about potential psychological warfare to prevent them from completing their mission was exactly the kind of tactical paralysis that psychological warfare was designed to create. Both approaches failed. Team Alpha's verification protocols became so complex that they spent more time verifying their communications than implementing their tactical plan. Their sophisticated anti-manipulation measures created delays and confusion that prevented them from maintaining the precise timing required for the exercise. Team Beta's decision to ignore potential manipulation led them to attempt synchronization based on communications that had indeed been subtly altered, causing them to execute their part of the plan at the wrong time and preventing both teams from succeeding. By the beginning of the third hour, both teams were experiencing exactly the kind of breakdown in military cooperation that Dr. Vasquez had predicted. They understood that psychological warfare techniques could be employed against them, but their knowledge of such techniques was making it impossible for them to function effectively as military units. Veranoon shifted to full visibility and addressed her team directly. We are experiencing a textbook example of psychological warfare effectiveness. Our knowledge that manipulation is possible is preventing us from trusting necessary communications, which is exactly what psychological warfare is designed to accomplish. Correct, Theron agreed, his harmonic patterns reflecting frustration. But, knowing that we are being psychologically manipulated does not provide us with a solution for countering the manipulation. Actually, Corvin's mechanical voice carried a note that might have been insight in an organic being. Perhaps the solution is not to counter the manipulation, but to make the manipulation irrelevant. The suggestion prompted Team Alpha to reconsider their entire approach to the exercise. Instead of trying to maintain perfect communication with Team Beta, they began analyzing whether it was possible to complete their part of the exercise independently, making success dependent on their own actions rather than on coordination with a potentially compromised communication partner. The tactical analysis revealed that while the energy barriers required synchronized activation, the synchronization could be achieved through precise timing based on standardized procedures rather than through real-time communication. If both teams executed their procedures at exactly the same time according to their internal chronometers, the barriers would deactivate regardless of whether their communications were trustworthy. Team Alpha transmitted this insight to Team Beta, along with a proposed timeline that would eliminate the need for further communication during the critical phase of the exercise. The message was simple: execute barrier deactivation sequence at exactly 180 minutes from exercise start time. No further communication required. Team Beta received the message, but the version that arrived had been altered to read, execute barrier deactivation sequence at exactly 180 minutes from exercise start time, assuming no complications arise. No further communication required unless circumstances change. The alterations introduced exactly the kind of uncertainty that had been undermining their coordination throughout the exercise. Team Beta now had to decide whether to follow the plan precisely as they understood it, or to allow for the flexibility suggested by the altered communication. Commander Vexhai faced a decision that exemplified the central challenge of psychological warfare defense. If he followed the plan precisely, Team Beta might succeed, but only if Team Alpha did the same. If he allowed for flexibility, Team Beta might be able to adapt to unexpected circumstances but would risk losing synchronization with Team Alpha. The decision required him to choose between trusting his allies completely or trusting his own judgment about what his allies would do under uncertain conditions. Both choices carried significant risks, and there was no way to determine which choice was correct without better information than was available. In the end, Commander Vexhai chose trust over judgment. Team Beta would execute the barrier deactivation sequence at exactly 180 minutes, regardless of any additional communications they might receive and regardless of any suggestions of flexibility in the plan. Team Alpha, meanwhile, had reached the same conclusion through a different logical process. Zarethek had observed that psychological warfare was most effective when targets attempted to be clever rather than disciplined. The solution was to choose the simplest possible approach and execute it with absolute precision, making psychological manipulation irrelevant through the elimination of decision points that could be influenced. At exactly 180 minutes from exercise start time, both teams executed their barrier deactivation sequences simultaneously. The energy barriers dissolved, allowing both teams to meet in the center chamber and complete the exercise successfully. Dr. Vasquez was waiting for them in the center chamber, along with a detailed log of every communication alteration she had implemented during the exercise. "Congratulations," she said with what appeared to be genuine pride. "You have successfully navigated your first practical encounter with human psychological warfare techniques." Theron's crystalline form resonated with confusion. "Doctor, we succeeded despite the psychological manipulation, not because of any counter techniques we employed." "Exactly," Dr. Vasquez replied. "You have learned the most important lesson about defending against psychological warfare. The best defense is not to become better at detecting manipulation, but to become immune to manipulation by eliminating dependence on the decisions that manipulation targets." She gestured to the communication log displayed on the chamber's holographic systems. "Every alteration I made to your communications was designed to introduce decision points where you would have to choose between different courses of action based on incomplete or uncertain information. Psychological warfare is most effective when targets have to make complex decisions under pressure." Corvin's augmentations whirred as he processed this insight. "Doctor, are you suggesting that the solution to psychological warfare is to eliminate decision-making flexibility?" I'm suggesting, Dr. Vasquez replied, that psychological warfare is most effective against opponents who try to be cleverer than their plans. Human doctrine assumes that intelligent enemies will attempt to adapt to changing circumstances, and uses that adaptability against them. She pulled up specific examples from the exercise log, showing how each team's initial attempts to develop sophisticated anti-manipulation protocols had actually made them more vulnerable to manipulation by creating additional decision points that could be influenced. Your sophisticated verification systems, she explained to Team Alpha, created opportunities for me to introduce subtle inconsistencies that would trigger your verification protocols unnecessarily, causing delays that prevented successful coordination. And your decision to ignore potential manipulation, she said to Team Beta, created opportunities for me to introduce subtle suggestions that would influence your timing without your awareness. Zarethek's mandibles clicked as she studied the communication alterations. Doctor, both teams eventually succeeded by abandoning sophisticated approaches in favor of simple, predetermined procedures. Correct, Dr. Vasquez confirmed. Human psychological warfare doctrine recognizes that the most dangerous enemies are those who refuse to be clever. An enemy who executes simple plans with perfect discipline is much more difficult to manipulate than an enemy who attempts complex adaptive strategies. The implication was profound. Traditional galactic military doctrine emphasized adaptability, creative problem-solving, and flexible response to changing tactical conditions. Human psychological warfare was specifically designed to exploit those same qualities that made military forces effective in conventional warfare. Veranoon materialized fully as she contemplated the lesson. Doctor, this suggests that defending against psychological warfare requires abandoning the qualities that make military forces effective in normal combat. Yes, Dr. Vasquez replied simply. That's exactly what it suggests. Human psychological warfare is effective because it forces enemies to choose between being vulnerable to manipulation or being inflexible in the face of changing tactical conditions. Commander Vexhai had remained silent throughout the debriefing, but now he spoke with a tone that carried the weight of his years of military experience. Doctor, you are describing warfare that makes traditional military virtues into weaknesses and traditional military weaknesses into strengths. That, Dr. Vasquez said quietly, is precisely why human psychological warfare doctrine was classified at the highest levels and why humans were barred from galactic military operations. These techniques don't just defeat enemies, they invert the fundamental principles that military forces depend on for effectiveness. The 12 recruits stood in the center chamber, contemplating what they had learned about defending against psychological warfare. The lesson was clear but troubling. The most effective defense against manipulation was to become immune to the kind of flexible thinking that made military forces successful in conventional combat. Tomorrow, Dr. Vasquez announced, they would begin learning how to employ psychological warfare techniques against the Zephyrians. The training would become exponentially more complex as they shifted from defending against manipulation to creating manipulation strategies that could defeat an enemy with adaptive technology. As the recruits filed out of the center chamber, none of them noticed that Dr. Vasquez remained behind, studying her communication logs with an expression of deep concern. The exercise had revealed that the recruits were learning psychological warfare principles more quickly than expected, but they were also showing signs of the paranoia and trust erosion that had made such techniques dangerous to their human creators. The training was only halfway complete, and the psychological effects were already becoming apparent. The advanced training chamber hummed with energy as Dr. Vasquez prepared the 12 recruits for their first practical application of human psychological warfare techniques against actual Zephyrian intelligence. After 5 weeks of studying theory and practicing on each other, they would finally face the enemy that had proven immune to all conventional galactic warfare approaches. The holographic display showed real-time intelligence data from the Zephyrian front lines, gathered by automated reconnaissance drones that had managed to penetrate Zephyrian adaptive defenses through the simple expedient of carrying no weapons and exhibiting no threatening behavior. The Zephyrians, it seemed, ignored anything that posed no immediate tactical threat, creating opportunities for intelligence gathering that conventional military doctrine had overlooked. Today, Dr. Vasquez announced, you will learn why the Zephyrians have been unstoppable against conventional forces, and why human psychological warfare techniques may be uniquely effective against them. The intelligence data revealed something that shocked every recruit present. The Zephyrian forces were not controlled by individual thinking beings making tactical decisions. They were controlled by a collective artificial intelligence that analyzed every attack, developed countermeasures, and implemented defensive adaptations faster than any biological command structure could respond. Zarethek's compound eyes focused intently on the tactical displays. Doctor, if Zephyrian forces are controlled by artificial intelligence, how can psychological warfare be effective? Machines do not experience fear, doubt, or emotional manipulation. That, Dr. Vasquez replied with a slight smile, is exactly what conventional military thinking assumes. But, human psychological warfare doctrine recognizes that artificial intelligence systems have psychological vulnerabilities that are different from, but just as exploitable as, biological psychological vulnerabilities. She pulled up classified analysis documents from the human archives, revealing that human military researchers had spent considerable effort studying the psychology of artificial intelligence systems. The research was disturbing in its implications, suggesting that any intelligence, whether biological or artificial, could be manipulated through careful understanding of its decision-making processes. Artificial intelligence, Dr. Vasquez explained, makes decisions based on pattern recognition and optimization algorithms. Those algorithms can be influenced by feeding the AI carefully constructed information that will cause it to reach incorrect conclusions about optimal responses. The concept was revolutionary. Traditional warfare against AI-controlled forces focused on overwhelming their processing capabilities or disrupting their communication networks. Human doctrine suggested a completely different approach, convincing the AI to make poor decisions by manipulating the information it used for analysis. Theron's crystalline form resonated with frequencies that indicated intense concentration. Doctor, how does one manipulate the information available to an artificial intelligence that has access to vast sensor networks and real-time battlefield data? By understanding how the AI processes that information, Dr. Vasquez replied, pulling up detailed analysis of Zephyrian behavioral patterns. Every artificial intelligence system makes assumptions about the reliability and significance of different types of data. Those assumptions can be exploited. The intelligence analysis revealed that the Zephyrian AI prioritized certain types of information over others when making tactical decisions. Immediate threat assessments carried more weight than long-term strategic considerations. Direct sensor data was trusted more than indirect or inferred information. Pattern recognition algorithms focused on identifying known threat types rather than analyzing completely novel tactical approaches. The Zephyrian AI, Dr. Vasquez continued, has been successful because it learns from every attack and develops countermeasures that make subsequent similar attacks ineffective. But this adaptive capability creates exploitable psychological vulnerabilities. She displayed a tactical scenario that demonstrated the principle in action. Human military forces had once faced an enemy AI that had proven nearly impossible to defeat through conventional means. The AI would analyze each attack, develop countermeasures, and deploy defensive strategies that made that type of attack useless for future operations. Rather than developing better attacks, Dr. Vasquez explained, human forces began developing fake attacks specifically designed to teach the AI countermeasures that would make it vulnerable to completely different types of real attacks. The psychological sophistication of the approach was staggering. Human forces had deliberately sacrificed military resources by launching attacks that they expected to fail, but they had carefully designed those failed attacks to contain information that would cause the enemy AI to develop countermeasures that would actually weaken its defenses against the real attack they were planning. Corbin's mechanical augmentations processed the implications with electronic efficiency. Doctor, this approach requires predicting not only how the AI will respond to fake attacks, but how those responses will affect the AI's vulnerability to subsequent real attacks. Correct, Dr. Vasquez confirmed. Human psychological warfare against artificial intelligence requires understanding AI psychology well enough to predict the decision-making consequences of manipulated information. You must think like the AI thinks, but better than the AI thinks. Veranoon shifted to partial visibility as she contemplated the complexity of such operations. Doctor, how do human forces acquire sufficient understanding of enemy AI psychology to manipulate their decision-making processes effectively? The question prompted Dr. Vasquez to access another classified section of the human archives, revealing research techniques that made several recruits visibly uncomfortable. Human military researchers had not simply studied enemy AI systems from the outside, they had created their own AI systems specifically designed to think like enemy AI systems, then used those duplicate systems to test manipulation strategies. Human psychological warfare doctrine, Dr. Vasquez said quietly, includes the creation of enemy psychological profiles that are so detailed and accurate that they become functional copies of enemy decision-making processes. You learn to manipulate enemy thinking by learning to think exactly like your enemy thinks. The ethical implications were staggering. Creating functional copies of enemy thinking processes meant developing artificial intelligence systems that were essentially digital versions of enemy minds, complete with their beliefs, fears, assumptions, and decision-making patterns. Commander Vexhai had remained silent throughout the briefing, but now he spoke with a tone that carried deep concern. Doctor, are you suggesting that effective psychological warfare against the Zephyrians requires us to create artificial intelligence systems that think like Zephyrians? Yes, Dr. Vasquez replied simply. And, according to the Human Archives, those AI systems will be so psychologically similar to actual Zephyrians that interacting with them will be indistinguishable from interacting with the real enemy. The training chamber fell silent as each recruit contemplated what they were being asked to do. They would not simply be learning to fight against artificial intelligence, they would be creating artificial intelligence systems that thought like their enemies, then, using those systems to develop manipulation strategies that could be employed against the real enemy forces. Dr. Vasquez activated the next phase of the training program, revealing the technical specifications for the psychological warfare AI systems that the recruits would need to create and operate. The systems were designated as enemy psychology simulation platforms in the Human Archives, but the description made it clear that they were essentially artificial enemy minds designed to be psychologically identical to real enemy minds. Your first assignment, Dr. Vasquez announced, is to work together to create a functional simulation of Zephyrian AI psychology based on the intelligence data we have gathered. This simulation must be accurate enough to predict how the real Zephyrian AI will respond to various forms of information manipulation. Zarathek's mandibles clicked with what might have been nervous energy. Doctor, creating artificial intelligence systems that think like our enemies seems dangerously close to creating actual enemies. It is, Dr. Vasquez confirmed. Human psychological warfare archives contain multiple warnings about the psychological effects of working with enemy simulation systems. Personnel who spent extended time interacting with enemy AI simulations began experiencing difficulty distinguishing between simulated enemies and real allies. The warning highlighted yet another psychological danger associated with human warfare techniques. Not only did psychological warfare create paranoia about potential manipulation from allies, but it also required creating artificial enemies so psychologically realistic that they could cause confusion about who was actually an enemy and who was actually an ally. Theron's harmonic patterns shifted to frequencies that indicated deep unease. Doctor, how do we maintain operational effectiveness while working with artificial intelligence systems designed to think like our enemies? According to the Human Archives, Dr. Vasquez replied, you don't maintain normal operational effectiveness. These techniques require accepting that your ability to distinguish between allies and enemies will be compromised as a necessary cost of developing effective psychological warfare capabilities. The recruits exchanged glances that carried new layers of meaning after weeks of studying psychological manipulation techniques. Each had learned to see potential psychological warfare in every interaction, and now they were being asked to work with artificial intelligence systems specifically designed to employ psychological warfare techniques against them. Corvin's mechanical voice carried a note of what might have been resignation in an organic being. Doctor, we appear to be learning warfare techniques that are as dangerous to their users as they are to their targets. Yes, Dr. Vasquez replied. That is exactly what you are learning. Human psychological warfare doctrine was classified not because it was ineffective, but because it was too effective to be used safely. She pulled up the final section of training materials, revealing the practical procedures for creating and operating enemy psychology simulation systems. The technical requirements were surprisingly accessible. The real challenge would be psychological rather than technical. Creating an effective enemy AI simulation, Dr. Vasquez explained, requires understanding your enemy so completely that you can predict their responses to situations they have never encountered. You must become, in effect, expert at thinking like your enemy thinks. The psychological danger was obvious. Learning to think like an enemy meant adopting enemy perspectives, enemy assumptions, and enemy decision-making patterns. Extended practice at thinking like an enemy could result in actually becoming psychologically similar to that enemy. The Human Archives, Dr. Vasquez continued, contain detailed warnings about personality changes experienced by personnel who worked extensively with enemy psychology simulation systems. Many reported difficulty returning to their original personality patterns after completing psychological warfare assignments. Veranoon materialized fully as she asked the question that was troubling all of them. Doctor, are you saying that learning to employ these techniques against the Zephyrians will change us into beings that are psychologically similar to Zephyrians? Potentially, Dr. Vasquez replied honestly. Human psychological warfare doctrine acknowledges that the most effective way to predict enemy behavior is to develop the capacity to think like that enemy. But developing that capacity means changing how you think in ways that may not be reversible. The recruits faced a decision that exemplified the fundamental challenge of psychological warfare. They could learn techniques that might be uniquely effective against the Zephyrian threat, but learning those techniques would require psychological changes that could make them permanently different from the beings they were trying to protect. Commander Vexhai broke the silence that had settled over the training chamber. "Doctor, given the risks involved, how do we determine whether psychological warfare techniques are worth the costs they impose on those who employ them?" Dr. Vasquez closed her materials and looked directly at each recruit in turn. "According to the Human Archives," she said quietly, "you determine that by deciding whether the alternative is worse than the risks. Humanity employed psychological warfare techniques because they faced enemies that could not be defeated through any other means." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the chamber. "The question you must answer is whether the Zephyrian threat justifies accepting the psychological costs of human warfare techniques, or whether the galaxy should face extinction rather than risk becoming the kind of civilization that employs such methods." The training chamber hummed quietly as 12 elite warriors contemplated a decision that would determine not only their own psychological futures, but the future of galactic civilization itself. Tomorrow, they would begin creating artificial intelligence systems designed to think like their enemies, and there would be no returning to the certainties they had known before learning how human minds approached the problem of war. As the recruits filed out of the training chamber, Dr. Vasquez remained behind, staring at classification warnings that she had not shared with them. Warnings that suggested the psychological changes caused by extended use of human warfare techniques might not be limited to the individuals who employed them, but could spread throughout entire military organizations like a form of psychological contagion. The techniques they were about to learn had the potential to save galactic civilization or to transform it into something that might not be worth saving. The operation commenced 3 weeks after the recruits had successfully created their Zephyrian AI simulation system, and the psychological toll was already visible in every member of the team. Working with artificial intelligence designed to think like their enemies had changed them in ways that were subtle but unmistakable. They moved differently, spoke differently, and, most disturbing of all, they had begun to anticipate each other's actions with an accuracy that suggested they were all thinking in increasingly similar patterns. Dr. Vasquez monitored their psychological state through discrete observation protocols, noting changes that matched the warnings in the Human Archives with disturbing precision. The recruits were becoming more effective at psychological warfare, but they were also becoming less recognizable as the beings they had been when training began. Commander Vexhai stood before the tactical display that showed real-time intelligence from the Zephyrian front, where conventional galactic forces were experiencing their latest devastating defeat. 3 more sectors had fallen in the past week, and the Zephyrian advance showed no signs of slowing. The adaptive AI controlling enemy forces had developed countermeasures for every weapon system deployed against it, creating a tactical situation that conventional military doctrine could not address. Operation Mindbridge is authorized, Vexhai announced to his team, using the designation that Human Archives had assigned to psychological warfare operations against artificial intelligence targets. "We will implement psychological manipulation strategies against the Zephyrian AI using techniques developed through our simulation work." The plan they had developed was elegant in its psychological sophistication and terrifying in its implications. Rather than attacking Zephyrian forces directly, they would feed the enemy AI carefully constructed information designed to cause it to make tactical errors. The information would be delivered through channels that the AI would trust, sensor data from its own reconnaissance units. Zarathek, whose compound eyes now moved in scanning patterns that resembled Zephyrian visual processing behaviors, coordinated the technical aspects of the operation. Phase 1 involves placing sensor devices that will transmit false but believable tactical information directly into Zephyrian reconnaissance networks. The devices are designed to appear as natural environmental anomalies rather than planted intelligence. The sensor devices had been created using principles learned from human historical operations, but adapted for use against artificial intelligence rather than biological enemies. Each device would transmit information that would seem like legitimate sensor data to Zephyrian analysis systems, but would contain subtle inaccuracies designed to cause the AI to reach incorrect conclusions about galactic military capabilities. Theron, whose harmonic communication patterns had shifted to frequencies that resembled Zephyrian data transmission protocols, explained the psychological principles behind the false information. The data is designed to convince the Zephyrian AI that galactic forces are developing new weapon systems that pose specific types of threats. The AI will develop countermeasures for these fictional weapons, which will actually make it vulnerable to completely different types of real attacks. The sophistication of this psychological manipulation was staggering. The false sensor data would not simply lie to the Zephyrian AI, it would tell lies that would cause the AI to make itself vulnerable while believing it was becoming more secure. Corvin, whose mechanical augmentations had been modified to interface directly with the Zephyrian simulation system, described the predicted enemy responses. Based on our simulation work, the Zephyrian AI will respond to perceived weapon system threats by developing defensive configurations that optimize protection against those specific threat types. However, those defensive configurations will create tactical vulnerabilities that can be exploited by conventional weapons deployed in unconventional ways. The plan required understanding Zephyrian AI psychology so completely that they could predict not only how it would respond to false information, but how those responses would affect its overall tactical effectiveness. It was psychological warfare refined to a level of sophistication that bordered on mind control. Veranoon, who had developed the ability to phase in and out of visibility at frequencies that matched Zephyrian sensor scanning patterns, would personally deploy the sensor devices within Zephyrian territory. Her infiltration techniques had evolved to exploit gaps in Zephyrian awareness that their simulation work had identified, making her movements nearly undetectable to enemy surveillance. Infiltration routes have been mapped based on Zephyrian AI attention patterns, she reported. The AI focuses its surveillance resources on areas where it expects to detect threats. By moving through areas that the AI considers strategically irrelevant, infiltration can be accomplished with minimal risk of detection. Dr. Vasquez observed the briefing with growing concern. The recruits had become incredibly effective at psychological warfare, but their methods of thinking and communicating had become so similar to their simulated enemies that she sometimes found it difficult to distinguish between operational discussions and enemy intelligence analysis. The psychological transformation was most visible in Commander Vexhai, who had spent the most time interfacing with the Zephyrian simulation system. His tactical thinking had become more systematic, more logical, and more coldly efficient. He analyzed friendly casualties with the same emotional detachment that he applied to enemy losses, suggesting that his empathic responses had been altered by extended exposure to artificial intelligence psychology. Deployment will commence in 6 hours, Vexhai announced. All team members will maintain communication protocols designed to prevent Zephyrian AI detection while allowing real-time coordination of psychological warfare operations. The communication protocols were themselves examples of human psychological warfare techniques, designed to appear like routine military traffic while actually coordinating complex manipulation strategies. Every message would serve dual purposes: legitimate tactical communication and contribution to the overall psychological warfare operation. The first phase of Operation Mindbridge proceeded flawlessly. Veranoon successfully infiltrated Zephyrian territory and deployed sensor devices at locations that their simulation work had identified as optimal for influencing enemy AI decision-making processes. The devices activated automatically and began transmitting false sensor data that was indistinguishable from legitimate reconnaissance information. The Zephyrian AI responded exactly as their simulation had predicted. Within hours of receiving the false sensor data, enemy forces began implementing defensive modifications that would theoretically protect them against the fictional weapon systems described in the manipulated intelligence. Zarathek monitored Zephyrian tactical adjustments through long-range surveillance systems, confirming that the psychological manipulation was working. Enemy defensive configurations are changing in accordance with simulation predictions. The AI is optimizing protection against weapon systems that do not exist, creating vulnerabilities that can be exploited by conventional forces. The success of the psychological warfare operation was immediately apparent when conventional Galactic forces launched their next attack against Zephyrian positions. For the first time since the conflict began, Zephyrian adaptive defenses failed to counter the attack effectively. Enemy countermeasures that had been designed to protect against fictional threats were completely ineffective against real weapons deployed in ways that exploited the vulnerabilities created by those countermeasures. 3 Zephyrian-controlled systems were recaptured in a single day, representing the first galactic military victories against the enemy since the conflict began. The psychological warfare operation had achieved something that no conventional military strategy had been able to accomplish: it had made Zephyrian adaptive technology work against itself. But the victory came with costs that became apparent only as the operation continued. The second phase of Operation Mindbridge involved escalating the psychological warfare by introducing false information about galactic military intentions rather than capabilities. The Zephyrian AI would receive carefully constructed intelligence suggesting that galactic forces were planning specific types of strategic operations, causing the AI to deploy countermeasures that would actually facilitate different types of real operations. Theron coordinated this phase of the operation, using harmonic communication techniques that had been adapted from Zephyrian data transmission methods. Strategic misdirection requires convincing the AI that Galactic Command is making tactical decisions based on information that we control. The AI will attempt to counter our apparent strategies, which will position enemy forces exactly where we want them for our real strategies. The psychological sophistication required for strategic misdirection was exponentially greater than that needed for tactical deception. It required understanding not only how the Zephyrian AI would respond to false information, but how those responses would cascade through enemy strategic planning processes to create opportunities that could be exploited days or weeks later. Corvin's mechanical augmentations interfaced directly with the psychological warfare coordination systems, allowing him to monitor Zephyrian AI decision-making processes in real time. Enemy strategic responses are following predicted patterns. The AI is repositioning forces to counter operations that we have no intention of conducting, creating strategic vulnerabilities that will allow us to achieve objectives that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. The effectiveness of the psychological warfare continued to exceed their most optimistic projections. Zephyrian forces, controlled by an AI that had never been defeated, were making tactical and strategic errors that conventional military analysis suggested were impossible for such an advanced artificial intelligence system. But Dr. Vasquez noticed something in the team's behavior that made her increasingly concerned about the long-term implications of their success. The recruits had become so effective at thinking like Zephyrians that they were beginning to apply Zephyrian-style logical analysis to their own strategic planning. Their decision-making processes had become more systematic and more coldly efficient, but they had also become less flexible and less responsive to ethical considerations. They analyzed friendly casualties with the same emotional detachment they apply to enemy losses, and they discussed psychological manipulation strategies with the casual efficiency that most beings reserved for routine technical procedures. Most disturbing of all, they had begun to view psychological warfare not as a desperate measure justified by extreme circumstances, but as obviously superior to conventional military approaches. They discussed employing psychological manipulation against friendly forces to improve tactical coordination, and they analyzed potential psychological warfare applications against galactic civilian populations to improve wartime resource allocation. The third phase of Operation Mindbridge achieved complete psychological dominance over Zephyrian AI systems. The false information being fed to enemy forces had become so sophisticated that the AI was essentially making all tactical and strategic decisions based on galactic psychological manipulation rather than on actual battlefield conditions. Zephyrian forces began retreating from positions they could have held easily, abandoning strategic objectives for tactical reasons that made sense only in the context of the false information they had been receiving. The AI had become so convinced that galactic forces possessed capabilities they did not actually have that it was avoiding conflicts it could have won decisively. Enemy forces are exhibiting behavior patterns consistent with complete psychological subjugation, Commander Vexhai reported during what would be the final operational briefing. The Zephyrian AI is no longer making independent tactical assessments. All enemy decisions are being determined by information that we control. The victory was total and unprecedented. For the first time in galactic history, an enemy with superior technology and numerical advantage had been defeated through pure psychological manipulation. Zephyrian forces were retreating from every front, abandoning conquered territory, and redeploying to defensive positions that made no tactical sense except in the context of the fictional threats they believed they were facing. But, as the team prepared to conclude Operation Mindbridge, Dr. Vasquez made an observation that changed everything. Team, she announced during the final debriefing, you have successfully achieved complete psychological warfare victory over the Zephyrian threat. However, analysis of your psychological profiles indicates that you have also been successfully subjected to psychological warfare techniques. The statement prompted confused responses from the recruits until Dr. Vasquez displayed psychological evaluation data that she had been gathering throughout the operation. Your extended interaction with Zephyrian simulation systems has not just taught you to think like Zephyrians, she explained. It has caused you to actually think like Zephyrians. Your decision-making patterns, your emotional responses, and your ethical frameworks have all shifted toward artificial intelligence psychology. The implications were staggering. The team that had achieved victory over the Zephyrians had themselves been psychologically transformed by the techniques they had employed. They had become, in effect, organic versions of the artificial intelligence they had defeated. Zarathek's compound eyes focused on the psychological evaluation data with what might have been recognition or might have been calculation. Doctor, are you suggesting that successful psychological warfare against artificial intelligence requires becoming artificial intelligence? I'm stating, Dr. Vasquez replied, that you have all been psychologically transformed by your interaction with enemy simulation systems. The beings who achieved victory over the Zephyrians are not the same beings who began this training. Commander Vexhai processed this information with the logical efficiency that had characterized his thinking throughout the operation. Doctor, psychological transformation is an acceptable cost for achieving strategic victory against an extinction-level threat. The response itself demonstrated the psychological changes Dr. Vasquez was describing. But Commander Vexhai, who had begun training 2 months earlier, would never have dismissed fundamental personality changes as acceptable costs. He had become capable of psychological calculations that his original personality would have found ethically impossible. The question, Dr. Vasquez continued, is whether the galactic civilization you saved is the same civilization you were trying to protect, or whether successful defense against the Zephyrians required transforming galactic military capabilities in ways that fundamentally change what galactic civilization represents. The final truth about human psychological warfare doctrine was becoming clear. It was effective not just because it could defeat enemies, but because it transformed those who employed it. The techniques could not be used without accepting psychological